Hi there. We are Jim and Jonna Schuster, and this is a glimpse into our world.
Conversations from our living room. Unscripted, without agenda, prompted by the Holy Spirit.
And usually over coffee.
About what God is saying to us right now.
No promises on what you'll get. Rev bombs, rants, breakthroughs, victories. It's all fair game.
But we hope it's a place of encountering the depths of the Lord together.
So come explore with us here on the Catholic Revival Ministries podcast.
We are here with part 3 of our podcast series on the topic of hearing God's voice, and our guest today is Chris Perry, who will be sharing about his experience deepening his relationship with the Lord by learning the art of hearing and discerning God's voice in prayer. For those reading along in my book, Hearing God's Voice, A Catholic Guide to Listening Prayer, this episode correlates with section 2 in the book, which covers the practicals of listening for and discerning God's voice in prayer, as well as how to steward your connection with the Lord. Some of the key concepts from section 2 include the different ways or languages through which God can speak to us, how to discern what you've heard so that you can distinguish whether it was God's voice speaking or the voice of the enemy or just your own internal voice, what to do with what you heard in prayer, namely how to deal with the lies that you encounter from the enemy, and more importantly, how to engage with a rhema word or the thing that God has spoken to further your dialogue and connection with the Lord, and a little bit of troubleshooting what to do if you run into what seems to be silence from God. So with that, I'd like to introduce Chris Perry, our guest today, who is also a dear friend of mine I've had the privilege of knowing for the past 15 years. Chris and I first met through the youth ministry program that Jim and I led at our parish in Northern Virginia, where Chris was a treasured volunteer leader. He was also one of the first people that we had the honor of sharing this content with early on in its development, which we did in the format of a day-long workshop back in 2015. I remember that workshop, Chris, being a very transformative experience for all of us at the time, and I'm so grateful to have you here as a guest today to hear about your experience in learning to hear God and to glean from your wisdom. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Jonna. It's always a pleasure to be with you and chat with you, and I'm really looking forward to sharing my experience.
Oh, wonderful. So I would like to start by inviting you back to that very first Hearing God's Voice workshop that you were part of 9 years ago, if you can remember. I can't believe it's been 9 years. How would you describe your relationship with God leading up to that point in time, and how did it change afterwards going forward?
Sure. Let me first say, I remember that workshop like it was just a few days ago, because it was such an eye-opening experience that I can literally remember everything that we went through on that. So,
wow. Me too, actually.
Yeah, and I hope everybody else's experience is that same way.
Yeah.
And, just to sort of set the stage, set the context, we talked about 9 years ago, but that really doesn't expose the fact that I was in my late 50s at the time.
Yeah.
And some people listening to this may be in their teens or young adults or middle age. For me, it was really late in my life. And so that really does relate to your question, because I spent my whole life sort of experiencing God in more of a distant manner. You could say I had a, quote, personal relationship with Jesus, the type of thing. But what it was like was more of this one-way communication.
Yeah.
A lot of times in prayer, we come to prayer and we sort of throw those prayers up to heaven.
Yeah.
And, we say, okay, well, that's it. It's sort of this distant communication. And the way I'd sort of like to describe it was sort of like, imagine if you were a child living and growing up with a loving and caring parent, but you didn't perceive the parent as being responsive or personal.
Yeah.
You knew that they were loving, they were caring, they took care of you, but there wasn't an acknowledgement or sense of empathy or compassion. Mm. And we have to remember that God is a parent with billions of loving children. So it's really easy for you to go, well, God's a busy person.
Yes.
And I shouldn't really have that desire or that need to hear directly from them. So up until that point, that's sort of the context I was in. It wasn't necessarily a disappointment per se. It was just, I grew up for almost 60 years of that's just how God is.
Yeah, same for me. That was just the reality of the expectation of having any kind of reciprocity from the Lord in prayer was just non-existent. There was just no sort of precedent for that set in my life either.
Yeah.
So how did it change going forward for you then?
It was quite an awakening, particularly starting with that workshop. It was like a spark. A light bulb got turned on, a switch got flipped. So you can think of, before it was like using a public address system or a bullhorn, it was me talking out to God. All of a sudden now there was this feeling that it's a two-way communication, like having a cell phone or a walkie-talkie or whatever. There was actually feedback. And, it's just this new sense of awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So then what was the catalyst for you then that kind of flipped that switch, or that I guess made you aware that this was possible?
Well, of course, we worked through several different exercises, and I remember, I think we even used the description of it's like tuning a radio. And this is old school radio. So those of us that really had radios that we had to tune, that radio signal is always out there. But if you're not tuned to that band on the radio, you're not going to hear it. So once I understood, well, the signal's out there, I just need to turn into it. That was actually really helpful to me in understanding what I was going after in that regard.
Yeah. So the practical, it sounds like, was really the key for you. Just practically, how do I listen?
Yeah. And so, after that point, what it sort of motivated me to do, the next thing was sort of a reflection of, okay, if I can hear God's voice, was it possible that God was out there all the time, that he was speaking to me all the time? And there was this, I'll call it awareness of, I sort of reflected back and said, well, I heard that. It's sort of like hearing somebody's voice and going, I've heard that voice before.
Yeah.
And so there was that awareness and that remembrance that there were times that I had been hearing God's voice and I didn't even realize that was it. And I'll give you a good example. I felt that a lot of times, this is just me. A lot of times when I get up in the morning and I'm getting ready to go to work and I'm taking a shower, things come to me in the shower. Mm-hmm. So, and things I have been thinking about or wondering about or praying to God about, things would just come to me. And then I was able to attach that to God speaking or, Holy Spirit, enlightening me so that what I had attributed maybe to, I just happened to have a spurious thought that, oh, that's the answer to it. I was able to connect the dots and go back, no, that was God speaking to me. I just didn't recognize where that was coming from.
That's so fascinating to hear. I want to go back to what you had said, using the analogy of a walkie-talkie to describe this back and forth relationship with God, because as a spoiler, Chris, you haven't read the book, but I actually use that analogy in my book to talk about the dynamic that we have when listening for God's voice. It's not just one way, but it's two-way communication. And I love fleshing that out the way that you did in terms of, like, you have to tune to a particular channel on a walkie-talkie in order to connect with the person on the other end. Like if I'm on channel 1 and you're on channel 6, we're not going to hear each other. And so you have to tune to the right channel or frequency, so to speak. And so I love the idea of that image as a representation of when we are trying to hear God, we have to figure out what quote unquote channel he's on. And we do that by listening through the various potential languages that God might be speaking to us through, like seeing or hearing or thinking or feeling. And I kind of unpacked that more deeply in the book, but it sounds like that was part of your experience as well, where, and this is very common, I've heard from a lot of people who've gone through this process of learning, where they realize that all along, God had been speaking to them. They had been tuned to the correct channel. They just didn't realize that he was the one speaking. So they would have ideas and thoughts that were kind of like you said, like revelatory in nature or inspiring. And you thought, oh, that was a great idea. But it was actually the Holy Spirit who provided that idea or that inspiration. And other people who have had words or images or phrases come to mind that they thought it was just their own inner thoughts, but it turns out it was God inspiring those thoughts and communicating to them through those things that he was calling to their attention. And so I love the way that you're talking about this, because this has been my experience as well, and why I sort of developed the language in the manner that I did. But it's so consistent with other people who have shared about this as well. Like, I feel like the Holy Spirit almost has an MO in the way that he enjoys speaking with us and engaging with us. And it's not through effort on our part we have to fix ourselves or we have to do something to make ourselves worthy of hearing the Holy Spirit. We just have to tune to the right channel. We just have to learn, how do I listen? What is the language that I can point my attention toward or my awareness toward, so that I can perceive when God is speaking? And I love that was your experience, Chris.
I'd like to just reaffirm what you said. I'm glad you brought that out. When you think in the physical realm, we have 5 senses that, we use that to connect with the world. And the same thing in the spiritual realm. As you said, a lot of times when I'm communicating with God, it's not like that small inner voice necessarily. Sometimes I will get, a picture, or maybe it's a song that you would get that would bring enlightenment. Sometimes it's the sense of touch, a feeling. An example of that is right about the same time we had this workshop, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And the first week or so was really, really tough for me. And I was in deep prayer. And all of a sudden, I got this sense of, I've got this, God telling me, I got this, don't worry, have peace. And all the way through the treatment that I went through several months thereafter, there was just this amazing peace that I carried with me as we were going through it. So there are, I'm glad you mentioned that there are different dynamics. It's not like just that small inner voice.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Oh, wow. What a gift to have had God accompany you through that experience in the form of, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. So that makes sense that if you experience his presence, then the fruit of that would be peace. How beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So, Chris, I know that you've also been really invested in growing your capacity to hear God's voice since that initial experience that you had unlocking this possibility at that workshop. So, as you grew in the art of listening and discerning God's voice over time, what obstacles did you encounter and how did you overcome them?
That's a really good question, because there certainly are obstacles, and I expect everybody's going to experience this. I think a couple of the first ones I had to address was first doubt. It's just, is that God's voice? Is that my voice?
Yeah.
You sort of second guess what you're hearing. I think the way I addressed that to begin with was not really my own technique, but something I was encouraged, is to listen first and don't analyze, don't judge, just listen, receive, and not trying to interpret things as they come. I know it's, I catch myself doing this. A lot of us do this. Like if you're in a meeting and somebody else is talking, you'll hear the first half sentence that somebody says, and immediately your brain kicks into gear and you're thinking about, how do I respond?
That's so true.
What is the full message that's trying to be delivered here? So it's the same thing with God, is be patient, listen solidly to hear everything. And once you've heard God, then that's the time to go back and reflect on it and to discern, was that really God's voice? So you want to say, does what you hear ring true?
Yeah.
Is there a sense of truth to it?
Yeah.
Is it consistent with what's in the Bible?
Yeah.
Is it consistent with what you know about God? Is it consistent with Catholic teaching?
Yeah.
And then if there's a question, if there's a misunderstanding, then go back to God, with a question. This is a dialogue. This is a two-way communication. Don't forget that. It's not okay, I'll pose a question, God gives me an answer, and close the book.
Right.
It is meant to be a normal conversation with God.
Yes.
So
Yes.
now I'll ask something, I'll receive, I'll sort of think about it and go, is there something I don't understand? Is it confusing? And if there is, I just go back and, God, can you tell me a little bit more of that or explain this further? And that has been very helpful to approach it as a dialogue.
Yeah.
The second thing, second aspect that I had to work with was sort of a sense of fear, I have to admit, of what if I'm getting it wrong? And, what would be the consequences? Would there be sort of like a potential embarrassment?
Yeah.
Oh, I misheard God, So the only way that I think you can overcome that and build trust or build courage is through experience.
Yeah.
You are going to have your doubts. You are going to have your fears initially.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is sometimes you do get it wrong. Just admit it.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a fear. I'm going to get it wrong. Okay, I'm going to get it wrong. And that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And you don't sort of sweat over it, and concern about it. Then when you look back and realize that you might have missed it, sort of, was there any indication that I overlooked that I should have picked up on that? No, that wasn't right. Because that, once again, helps you be a better discerner.
Yeah, it's like that mistake becomes a source of intel so that you can go back and study, all right, how did I miss it this time? And how can I make sure that I don't miss it next time?
Yeah.
I just want to comment and affirm, I love everything that you were sharing about overcoming these doubts and fears. And the route to doing that for you sounded like exercising discernment and being patient and allowing this relationship with the Lord and this dialogue to just organically grow over time, because as you get to know him and the sound of his voice, you naturally start to become more accustomed to the sound of it. And I love that sort of slow, like marathon approach, because I think a lot of people might feel discouraged that they're not, a whiz at this right off the bat. But this is kind of the long journey that we're on and getting to know the Lord more deeply. And all of the things that you mentioned are things that so many people I know have encountered as I've been coaching them. They want to sort of rush as they're hearing from the Lord. They kind of want to rush and make a decision on, was that the Lord or was it not, before they're even done listening. And I've actually learned to help people pause and just hear it, just receive it. And then afterwards, you can go back and evaluate. You don't have to do it in the moment, in real time. Our lifestyle pace is so quick that we don't have to bring that same pace into our prayer times. So I loved everything you said. That was just so beautifully spoken and 100% lines up with the experience of so many other people in this area. It's just so helpful to hear you articulate that. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, and that really does lead into or touch on the two other things I was going to say, and I'll start with what I considered the second. But you talk about patience, and one of the challenges is impatient. And when you go into a prayer time, as much as possible, make sure you give yourself enough time.
Yeah,
this isn't something you necessarily want to rush through. Sometimes you have to make a quick prayer and like that, but make sure you give yourself enough time. And really, if your prayer time is taking longer than you really expected, sort of ask yourself, well, what is more important than talking with God? Okay, you're maybe into a dialogue with God or whatever, sometimes the discussion, the friendly discussion, if like you're having with a close friend, you may spend half an hour with your friend or whatever, it's not I do 10 minutes in the morning type thing. Sometimes your discussion is going to be longer. So, be patient and give yourself enough time.
So
the second inhibitor I've had in hearing God's voice, I've discovered, is when I go into prayer time with a lack of peace.
Interesting.
Because that really, that can be a block if I'm not at peace. And sometimes it's hard to be at peace. But it's sort of like there's a lot of static
Yeah.
in the radio,
Yeah.
and it's blocking.
Yeah.
And that, once again, as you mentioned, it's practice. There is, over time, I just sort of encourage people, as you exercise this more and more, you learn how you are able to settle into that peace, and to settle into that communication, settle into that listening, settle into that hearing. So sometimes it's the connection either isn't immediate or it's noisy and staticky, and it does take practice, and you'll grow into the part where getting into that lane becomes easier and easier. But initially,
absolutely,
you come and there isn't a sense of peace, and that can be an inhibitor. And just recognize that.
Yeah.
I'm not at peace.
Yeah. I love that. And yes, it is the sort of thing that grows over time. It's okay that we're beginners, that we're learners in this process, and I think it's also an interesting tension to hold with, sometimes we need the presence of the Lord to find that peace. Like sometimes the world has us kind of spinning and in a whirlwind. And so it actually takes stepping into a mindset of prayer and putting ourselves with our focus on the presence of the Lord in order to recognize that peace and allow that peace to settle in. And so I love the role of how that fits into our ability to hear God. It is awfully difficult to hear him when things are loud and chaotic and messy. And even just the practice of give yourself some time to settle into peace or to find that peace at the onset of when you sit down to listen to the Lord. That could sidestep a lot of confusion for sure.
Yep.
Well, Chris, you've been doing this all along, so I don't know that maybe you'll have more to impart to us. But my final question for you is, what is one thing you would want to say to encourage someone who's just starting out with learning to hear God's voice in prayer?
Yeah, I've touched on it before, but I think it's going to be helpful if I reiterate. We sort of already talked about practice, and practice frequently.
Yeah.
If you have a daily quiet time, a daily prayer time that you spend with God, build that into that time. And one of the things right out of the gate that I was encouraged to do, that I really took on, was in my prayer time, I would journal. And so when I communicate with God, I would ask God a question and I'd write it in my journal.
Yeah.
And then I would listen and I would journal what I was hearing. And then, as I talked about before, when I got to sort of, okay, I've heard God's response, then I would sort of reflect back on it. And then I would ask another question. And so that created that dialogue for me.
Yeah.
Using the journal, it created that dialogue back and forth. And I was really surprised when I started doing that, because I would fill pages in one session, pages in my journal of what I heard back and forth. And it was so useful. When I was able to reflect back, then I would think about it later in the day, or think about it a week from then, or even several months. Oh yeah, I remember I was talking with God 2 months ago, and I'd be able to go back my journal and see what that dialogue looked like. So yeah, journaling was a very powerful tool for me, and it might be a powerful tool for others.
Yeah.
And the final thing is to just let God be God. I think of, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He put his, request up to God about taking this cup away from me. But then he says, not my will, but your will be done.
Yeah.
And so that would be the other thing, is that you always want to allow God to answer to you in his way, and not in the way that you want him to answer to you.
Yeah. Yeah. That brings it right back to what you were saying earlier about having patience and letting it be on God's terms. Let him say what he wants to say, when he wants to say it, how he wants to say it, and not to try to force him to say or do or be something other than who he already is.
Exactly.
Chris, you are just a fount of insight and wisdom and knowledge. And I'm just so glad we got to have this time together and that other people will get to hear the treasures that are within you. Thank you so much for being here, for being so generous and sharing of your experience and what you've learned in these years.
It's always my pleasure to chat with you, Jonna, and also my pleasure to share my experience with others. I try to do that on a regular basis, encourage others and, help them understand things that I've learned. It's always a pleasure for me to do that.
Beautiful.